You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's April 28th. I'm Meg Dalton.
And I'm Catherine Sullivan. Manhattan's only bird sanctuary is making strides in studying lead poisoning in children, using baby birds.
Can I put you in the carrier? Okay. Yes. It's gonna be a big bird.
A new organization is using urban obstacle courses to help veterans deal with stress.
The glory that you get from seeing your friends achieve something that they thought they're never going to be able to do.
Gun violence on Facebook Live has inspired Bronx activists to fight back. The Inwood community is against a plan for private development and a look back at the last elevated train in New York City.
So I was always aware that there are things in New York that here today, gone tomorrow.
But first, these headlines.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. Congress has approved a stopgap measure that keeps the government running for an extra week, but lawmakers will again face the threat of a partial shutdown if they fail to agree on a spending bill that keeps government funded through the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. The Trump administration is taking steps to allow more offshore drilling for oil and natural gas. NPR's Scott Horsley reports the move could result in opening areas of the Atlantic Ocean and off the coast of Alaska that had been closed to energy development.
President Trump signed an executive order directing his Interior Secretary to develop a new 5-year plan for offshore drilling. The order does not guarantee any new areas will be open for energy exploration, but that's clearly the president's ultimate goal.
Renewed offshore energy production will reduce the cost of energy, create countless new jobs, and make America more secure and far more energy independent.
Trump says the order also reverses an Obama-era ban on offshore drilling in the Arctic, though oil companies may have little appetite for costly Arctic drilling until oil prices move higher. Scott Horsley, NPR News, the White House.
Another setback for environmental groups. A U.S. appeals court has put a hold on a case over President Obama's signature climate plan. NPR's Jennifer Ludden reports the Trump administration had asked the court to step back while it tries to undo the regulation.
The Clean Power Plan would restrict carbon emissions from coal-fired power plants. More than 24 states and fossil fuel industry groups challenged it, and it never took effect. Arguments were last September at the U.S. Appeals Court in Washington, D.C., and a ruling could have come at any time. Instead, over the objections of environmental groups and 18 states, the court has granted a 60-day hold. It will then decide whether to send the regulation back to the Environmental Protection Agency, where the Trump administration could revise or do away with it. The Clean Power Plan was supposed to be how the U.S. met its obligations under the Paris climate deal. Jennifer Ludden, NPR News, Washington.
The Trump administration is urging the UN to impose tougher sanctions as well as downgrade or suspend diplomatic ties with North Korea for its continued nuclear and missile tests. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres cautioned against anyone acting too quickly over North Korea or DPRK.
The onus is on the DPRK to comply with its international obligations. At the same time, the international community must also step up its efforts to manage and reduce tensions. The absence of communication channels with the DPRK could be dangerous. Armed conflict in Northeast Asia, which is home to 1/5 of the world's people and gross domestic product, would have global implications.
China is also calling for restraint. The foreign minister, Wang Yi, told the Security Council Beijing is pressing North Korea to stop its nuclear work, but Wang says use of force will only lead to bigger disasters. You're listening to NPR News.
This is In New York, I'm Rebecca Scott. Attorney General Jeff Sessions visited Long Island this morning to announce plans to eradicate violent gang crime. The visit was in response to a spate of murders that have been traced to the MS-13 gang, which has connections to El Salvador, Colombia, and the Mafia. In the 20-minute speech, Sessions directly addressed gang members.
So I have a message for the gangs that target our young people. We are targeting you. We're coming after you.
Sessions says the Trump administration's tough stance on immigration will eliminate the gang, which has been connected to 15 homicides in Suffolk County over the past 6 months. Mayor de Blasio is defending his Department of Corrections commissioner. An investigation found that Joseph Ponte used a city-owned vehicle to travel out of state 90 times last year. De Blasio says Ponte had permission to use the car out of state. Ponte was one of 21 Department of Corrections staffers accused of using city cars to go places like Niagara Falls, the Mohegan Sun Casino in Connecticut, and the Poconos. Amtrak officials apologized this morning for the most recent Penn Station derailments. Chief Operating Officer Scott Naparstik says the March 24th and April 3rd derailments were caused by maintenance mistakes made by Amtrak employees.
Therefore, I am responsible for the operation and maintenance of New York Penn Station. And based on that, I do want to apologize for the inconvenience that all commuters have gone through over the last 30 days.
The apology follows an announcement yesterday that Amtrak will renovate tracks at New York's Penn Station this summer, a plan that will cost tens of millions of dollars and cause further delays for commuters. 15 subway lines will experience service disruptions this weekend, including the 1 train. It's 84 degrees out now, and you can expect more of the same for tomorrow. Temperatures will reach into the low 80s, and showers in the evening will lead to a cooler Sunday with highs in the low 60s. Rebecca Scott, Columbia Radio News.
I'm Katherine Sullivan. You're listening to Uptown Radio.
And I'm Meg Dalton. Just before midnight, the first span of the newest bridge in the last 5 decades opened last night. The Kosciuszko Bridge connects Brooklyn and Queens.
The new span is an upgrade to the 78-year-old bridge and part of Governor Cuomo's $500 million plan to strengthen the city's bridges and roadways. The new bridge has been outfitted with thousands of colorful LED lights. Last night, the lights were on, and it was time to celebrate. Emily Dugdale reports from Queens.
You can't get far talking about this bridge without running into a problem. How do you pronounce its name? In front of a packed crowd of politicians and community stakeholders, Cuomo set the record straight. New Yorkers who say Kosciuszko, you're wrong.
The Polish correct way to say the word is Kosciuszko. So repeat after me, the Kosciuszko Bridge.
The Kosciuszko Bridge is named after Tomasz Kosciuszko, a Polish-born Revolutionary War hero. It's about to hit its 8th decade, and it's getting a huge makeover. Yesterday, the first new span of the bridge opened to traffic, and the city took to the Queens side of the bridge to celebrate. It's just the first part of Cuomo's ambitious plan to light up every bridge in the city with dazzling LED lights. Queens native Tamika Williams-Moore is at the ceremony admiring the bridge. She says the LED lights are a step in the right direction to show off city treasures off the beaten path.
It's a beautiful bridge, and with the lighting, it's definitely going to attract tourists.
Cuomo hopes adding the colorful lights will not only make bridges safer, but also bring more money into the city. LED light installations on the San Francisco Bay Bridge reportedly brought in $100 million in economic activity, and this part of Queens would love the business tourists would bring. Susan Sanderson researches the evolution of LED light at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York. She says New York's plan to light up city infrastructure with LED is overdue.
New York does have to keep up. And New York City is kind of behind. What I think Cuomo is doing is he's really making that first generation investment.
It's an investment Sanderson's seen in other cities that will save energy, make roads safer, and increase tourism. Soon, she says, we'll see digital wireless communication and even biohazard detection through LEDs. Laying the groundwork for this on the bridge is essential.
The fact is that these cities have to be modernized and digitized, and lighting is just an important enabler in this whole thing.
But LED lights are just part of the bridge's makeover. Nearly 200,000 commuters use the Kosciuszko Bridge each day, and everyone agrees traffic is killer. Marta Strakowski is waiting in the rain just off the bridge. She's lived in the area for over 20 years.
Always traffic. I don't think I've ever been on this bridge where there wasn't like bumper to bumper.
And there's more.
Horrible conditions in terms of the asphalt and potholes and just a nightmare in one word.
Cuomo says now those problems are in the past. The updated bridge will cut traffic by 65% once the second span is finished. That's a nice thing to hear, especially for 14-year-old Sophia Wojner and her mom, Joanna, who drives her daughter to school over the bridge every day. Joanna doesn't speak English, so Sophia translates.
She said that, yes, there's a lot of traffic, and she's hoping that if they open it up more, there will be less, and she's really excited about it because she wants to spread the Polish heritage.
They're one of dozens of Polish families pressed up against the bridge, watching a piece of their history light up the skies. But while the lights will be fun, Joanna says there are better uses for the money.
She cares a lot for homeless people, so maybe instead of putting the lights on, give them homes and food and stuff like that.
But New York native Tamika Williams-Moore says the lights are living up to her expectations. She's holding a drink and swaying to Bruno Mars's hit Happy as Cuomo flips the switch and the LED lights start to dance over the steel bridge.
I'm having a great time. It makes you feel like you're happy to be a New Yorker tonight. Although tomorrow's Friday, we'll be back to the hustle and bustle.
At least it'll be a lot brighter in this corner of Queens. Emily Dugdale, Columbia Radio News.
Some New York City police officers in Washington Heights and Inwood have a new part of their uniform, a body camera. It's part of a pilot program that started yesterday afternoon. And if it's successful, Mayor de Blasio says all of New York City's 23,000 officers could wear them within a couple of years. The pilot program is court-mandated, ordered by a judge who found the police department's stop and frisk program unconstitutionally targeted minorities.
Ian Head was part of the legal team involved in the 2013 case. He works for the Center for Constitutional Rights. He says he's concerned about the new camera policy, specifically the discretion cops have when turning their cameras on and off.
I think it's really key for cameras to be turned on at the very beginning of stops, and unfortunately this policy doesn't do that. Instead, it gives vague language about interactions with people suspected of criminal activity. Well, that different officers could be interpreting that different ways. It also says officers should turn on the cameras during public interactions that escalate and become adversarial. Well, the whole point of the thing is not to turn on the camera once it becomes adversarial, whenever the officer feels like it's adversarial, but to capture the entire encounter.
What effect do body cameras have on policing?
The first major study was in a small department in Rialto, California. That study of a very small department seemed to show that body cameras will reduce uses of force by police officers. They would reduce complaints by civilians. Another survey found that body cameras have little effect, and in fact, if they aren't activated at the beginning of all encounters, don't really cut down on use of force at all.
So how was the pilot program shaped, and what does it actually involve?
It's a one-year program. You know, it's going to be in a limited number of precincts, although the court-appointed monitor has expanded the program. But the cameras are really, they were a suggestion as a potential way to kind of evaluate the effectiveness they might have in reducing unconstitutional stops and frisks.
So several police reform groups are speaking out against the program. What are their primary concerns?
One of their primary concerns is the when cameras are going to be turned on and how much are they going to capture and what the kind of officer's discretion is going to be in when they turn the camera on. I believe that a lot of the groups that we work with and throughout the city have been very in support of turning the cameras on at the beginning of any encounter.
Yeah, and people say body cameras can lead to greater transparency and accountability of police officers. What's the hope for this program?
There could be, greater transparency if the cameras are turned on at the very beginning of all encounters. If there is good auditing of the program, which is what the court laid out. They wanted the footage captured on the cameras to be reviewable by the courts and by supervisors in the NYPD and by the monitor and other oversight agencies so that we could, see what's going on and hopefully cut down on these unconstitutional stops.
That was Ian Head with the Center for Constitutional Rights. Thank you so much, Ian.
Thanks so much for having me.
As the NYPD deals with the challenges of body cameras, Facebook Live is challenging law enforcement as well. Since it launched a little over a year ago, Facebook Live has become a platform for people to stream their life events.
Recently, a number of violent videos, including an incident last week when a Cleveland man shot another man to death, have aired. As tech changes, interrupting violence is getting more complicated. Now, law enforcement and mental health officials in New York City are figuring out how to intervene when a crisis is happening in real time, online. Kristen Schwab reports from the Bronx.
It's a rainy Saturday evening, and I'm walking through the Morrisania neighborhood of the Bronx with Samuel Jackson. No, not that Samuel Jackson. This 39-year-old grew up in the Bronx. Today, he's what's called a violence interrupter at Release the Grip, a program funded by the city to curb gang violence. Jackson is out canvassing.
Yo, what up? Yo, what's good, brother? You all right?
He's trying to stop conflict before it starts.
What's up, brother? What's up? You all right, Chris?
We pass Chris, a teenager Jackson clearly knows.
That's another young kid right there. But he's young, and he's another one I like to stay on top of. Because he's like 16, I tell him stay in school.
Stay in school. Make curfew. Keep out of trouble. Jackson repeats these affirmations to kids at every corner. As we wander back to his office, we stop at a passageway between two buildings. This is where Jackson broke up his first big fight.
That happened right there, like by the benches. He had him on the ground. It was dark. When I seen the kid, I knew who he was. I was like, please put down the gun. Like, don't shoot him, you know. And he just came to his senses. He just got up and ran. I was like, thank God. Who knows if I wasn't there, what would have happened?
What would have happened? That's what people are dealing with, not just in person, but online. Video streaming services like Facebook Live allow us to be at a scene without physically being there. At the entrance of Release the Grip, there's a huge blue mural that says "Put down the guns." We walk up to the front door and into the makeshift office. Jackson's sneakers squeak on the linoleum. On a big whiteboard in red marker is the number 33.
We're going on 33 days without nobody being shot. Our longest record is 167. We matched it and it happened again.
That exact
Yes.
number of days?
Yes. Unbelievable.
Jackson settles into a big leather chair, takes out his laptop, and soon he's scrolling through Facebook. His profile is peppered with posts that say things like "Stop the violence" and "Put the guns down." But he's really online to scour other people's pages.
I'm also looking for high-risk things. I might see a fight video, or I might see somebody arguing, or I might see somebody depressed, you know. But basically, I'm looking for violence. I'm looking for people that's like, you know, had a bad, you know, they're going through something.
This scanning is something the Citizens Crime Commission of New York City recently added to Jackson's job description. The pilot program, called E-Responder, is being tested at 18 sites across the city. Jackson is trained to evaluate posts and, based on a set of criteria, label them low, medium, or high risk. Then he intervenes by leaving a comment, sending a Facebook message, or if it's nearby, going out himself to break it up. Jackson is the right guy to do this work. He knows firsthand how shiny violence can look to kids in this community because he grew up here. He was involved in a homicide and went to prison for 7 years. Then he sold drugs.
You see the drug addicts, you see the police sirens, you see the ambulance sirens, you see the users, the abusers, the drug dealers, and I was just infatuated by it.
This is one of the reasons why we really wanted to couple this program with real people in real places that have physical contact and connection with youth.
That's Shabnam Javdani, a psychology professor at New York University who helped build the E-Responder curriculum. She says community members like Jackson are critical to the program's success.
They have a real understanding of how violence can be prevented right before it happens. And having social media access and training about interrupting violence allowed them to prevent that violence. That's their first priority.
There's a big debate right now about violence on social media and what intervention looks like. Is it different online than it is on the street? Part of the problem is that researchers don't totally understand how violence manifests online. Desmond Patton teaches social work at Columbia University. He works with data scientists to track how teens navigate social media.
Oftentimes, young people are using social media as a GPS system to figure out, you know, where to go, who to talk to, who not to talk to, where's the hot spot, where's the safe spot.
Patton says it's not like kids wake up one day and decide to post a brawl on Facebook. There's usually a pattern of negative behavior online, and it's up to other people to intervene early.
There's actually a life that is unfolding on social media. Aggressive comments start from just petty arguments that unfold online, right? Oftentimes, grief and pain comes before a more threatening or aggressive post. Emojis and hashtags can be used as signals for violence to come.
But whose responsibility is it to step in? Parents can only hover so much, schools don't have endless resources, programs like Release the Grip are overworked. Some say live stream platforms should be responsible. But the thing about live video is it's live. Algorithms are great with words. If you Google how to kill yourself, the first hit will be the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. If enough people flag your statuses, Facebook will reach out to see if you need help. But if you make a video, experts say we could be a decade away from being able to screen live video. Until then, people like Samuel Jackson in the Bronx will keep canvassing online and on the street.
I mean, it's working, but it's a process. You know, it's day by day. We're giving them motivation and we're showing them you could change. I was you at one time. I did that. I sold drugs. I didn't carry guns. I didn't been to jail. And this is where I'm at in my life now. So don't think that you can't change. You can always change. This is that you got to want to change for yourself.
Jackson's goal? To make it 365 days without a shooting. Kristen Schwab, Columbia Radio News.
New York's homicide rate is down 14% from last year. But even though the rate is dropping, guns are still widely available in the city. That was the message from a panel led by Reverend Al Sharpton today in Times Square. The panel included filmmaker Spike Lee and community activists and district attorneys. They met to seek solutions to gun violence. Mike Elson-Rooney reports.
Aisha Sekou is one of the panelists at the National Action Network this morning. She's worked around gun violence for years, and she has a message for the panel and audience.
As we sit in this wonderful room and dressed up in our nice little outfits, our children are continuing to lose life.
Sekou's group is called Street Corner Resources, and they work with teenagers at risk of gun violence in Harlem. She says that even though they've had success, there's still one big roadblock in their work.
So when we talk about the decrease in homicides, that's great. I mean, that's wonderful. But let's talk about how there's an increase of the influx of guns coming into our community and the accessibility of young people having guns in their homes, in their backpacks, in schools. You know, we have some work to do.
It's hard to get exact numbers of how many guns are in the city because so many come in illegally. But a recent gun bust in Brooklyn turned up 217 guns, all of which came from Virginia. Robert Disney is a gun control activist at the Brady campaign, and he says the story of that gun bust is common. He says people often ask him, if gun control works, why do states like New York, with such strict laws, often end up flooded with guns?
Well, the reason is because most of those guns are trafficked from states where it's super easy to go in and buy a gun, and there are dealers that are willing to look the other way and not think that it's odd that someone would come in and buy 50 of the exact same type of gun, disappear for a week, and then come back and buy another 50.
Disney says that guns made in Pennsylvania, Virginia, or the Carolinas travel up the Iron Pipeline and find a home in New York City. Disney says that New York has been a leader in tracing guns based on their serial number, and that information can help give policymakers a better idea of how to stop their flow. But he wants even more transparency.
What we would have liked to have seen was a report that gets into the details and names names. They tell us who are those bad apple gun dealers. Because once that is out in the sunlight, once everybody knows who they are, then we can focus on what the task at hand, which is either reforming their business practices or we shut them down.
Disney says that legislation is the most effective way to stem the flow of guns across state lines. But until then, community leaders will continue to try to tackle the problem where they can. On the streets. Mike Elson-Rooney, Columbia Radio News.
Imagine that it's early in the morning. The cocks are crowing. And it's a restful, peaceful morning on the Upper West Side? This week, Pia Peterson takes a look at the hidden life of hurt birds and their saviors and Manhattan.
The Wild Bird Fund takes up 2 storefronts at 565 Columbus Avenue between 87th and 88th Street. It's the only rehabilitation center for wild animals in all of New York City. Christina Crescenti and Pamela Dervishi drove in from Astoria this morning to bring in an injured pigeon they spotted on the side of the road.
We found a bird basically lying on the street, and he was really hurt, and I was so upset. Got gloves and a box, and we brought him here, and we just hope that he's okay.
The pigeon is in a small cardboard box with the top folded closed. There's no movement coming from inside as they hand the bird over.
Oh. Thank you. All right, we're good? Yes. So as far as any updates?
This pigeon is one of thousands of birds treated here each year.
Hi there. My wife Jill Bolstrich called in about this.
Soon enough, the door opens up again. Nick Hudson is bringing in a baby chick that was found wandering around a parking lot in Bay Ridge, probably abandoned sometime after Easter.
Hi, sweetie.
Rita McMahon is ready to swoop in.
Okay. Yes. You're going to be a big bird. You're going to be a big bird.
Rita helps get the chick out of the t-shirt he's wrapped up in. Soon, he's ready to be checked in.
So if you could fill out this form, particularly in this area.
Sure.
That'd be great.
Rita McMahon is the founder of the Wild Bird Fund. She got her start 16 years ago when she found herself in a similar situation.
I was driving back to the city and I saw a Canada goose on the side of 684, which is a major 6-lane highway. Stopped, put it in the back seat of my car, came back down to New York and got on the phone. 3 days I called everywhere, everything. And there was no place in New York where you could bring injured wildlife. I ultimately just took it to the Animal Medical Center, put my credit card down, said it was my pet.
They gave it back to her the next day, saying, "Hey, lady, don't worry, it'll be fine." After all those phone calls, though, she knew the goose would have a better chance outside the city.
So I drove it 2 hours north to a waterfowl rehabilitation center. And the next day I got the call from the center saying it died.
The whole experience left Rita wanting something better. She began opening up her West Side apartment to injured birds. When she got up to about 60 birds, she opened the storefront on Columbus Avenue and hired some staff. Soon, people were able to search for their services on the internet.
And then it exploded. So, where I started at 300 birds a year, it was just about 5,000 last year.
Right now, there are over 200 patients and residents.
The downstairs clinic where most of our patients are.
There are baby birds in incubators, a wall of mostly pigeons in recovery, and a room with branches and bird feeders where migratory birds can stretch their wings behind a mesh door. Ariel Cordova Rojas is a young animal care manager and licensed wildlife rehabilitator.
Every morning, straight away, we have to give medications. And then following medications comes feedings, usually.
With rubber gloves, she lays out tiny syringes of medicine according to a chart. It sounds wild in here, but Ariel says,
This is relatively quiet. At one point, we had 14 fighting cocks with us, so that was fun.
And there's also something I have never before seen in New York City. Baby pigeons.
This guy is still yellow. Pigeons, when they're born, have this soft yellow down feathers. You can tell that he's probably about a week old because he has what we call pin feathers, which are his adult feathers growing in. So this guy is transitioning.
She points at his head, saying he probably fell out of the nest.
So he has a wound on the top of his head, probably from hitting it, and some feathers missing, probably from some nutritional deficit.
Now that he's stable and in the incubator, he's got a good chance of eventually being released. But there's more going on here than just rehabilitating birds. Researchers have studied these birds to better understand how we, pigeons and humans, live in the city. The Wild Bird Fund has treated well over 100 different species of birds, but more than half of the birds it sees are pigeons. Rita McMahon says by treating birds, one can learn a lot about our environment.
Up to 15% of our patients have lead poisoning. They didn't get it by eating lead. They got it from the soil and from the water, from the dust in the air.
Joanna Berger is an eco-toxicologist and distinguished professor at Rutgers University.
Pigeons and other birds are quite common, and they can be used as a sentinel of exposure of people, both in terms of heavy metals, but other contaminants as well. So they can be early indicators.
She says birds are often better than mammals in terms of assessing environmental impact on humans.
Birds are more similar to people in that both humans and birds use primarily visual and vocal means of communication.
And in places like cities, they're the animals that spend tons of time in the exact same habitats where we are. Elevated lead levels in pigeons directly correlates to elevated lead levels in children in a neighborhood. And like us, they don't like being in the hospital. On a Monday afternoon, a group gathers at the Wild Bird Fund for a discharge, a clapper rail, a shorebird with long legs and a long beak. The bird is waiting patiently in a small carrier.
He came yesterday. He was fine. He probably just banged into a building, a window collision, and he really is fine. He was aggressive and bit everyone, and then yeah, he even ate some goldfish. So we were happy for that.
He's recovered and ready to be released.
And we'll be in the park in just a minute. And we will be heading north to the North Woods.
There's a few birders and photographers when we get to the park, a quiet, marshy area by a waterfall.
So I'll give him a little nudge.
And with that, the bird is off. Pia Peterson, Columbia Radio News.
You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us.
You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Meg Dalton.
And I'm Catherine Sullivan. Coming up, the fashion side of the NFL draft, an Upper West Side fair trade store closes its doors, and a reflection on what it means to confess a sin. But first, these headlines.
In New York, I'm Camila Kerwin. This afternoon, President Trump addressed the National Rifle Association. He was the first sitting president to do so since Ronald Reagan in 1983. At the NRA's National Convention in Atlanta, Trump thanked the influential lobbying group for its support throughout his candidacy for president.
The 8-year assault on your Second Amendment freedoms has come to a crashing end.
President Trump also took the opportunity to reiterate his intention to build the wall. This despite having recently softened his position as a bargaining chip in Congress to avoid a governmental shutdown over the spending bill. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer called the speech a good way to end an incredible week. A new order was signed by the president this afternoon authorizing offshore drilling for oil and gas in the Arctic and Atlantic Oceans. Trump said renewing offshore energy production will reduce energy costs and create more jobs. The order could potentially lift restrictions imposed by the Obama administration, allowing drilling access to millions of marine acres currently designated national monuments. Overseas, all eyes are on North Korea and its nuclear and missile development. Today, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson urged the UN to take a stand against Pyongyang. He warned that failing to put pressure on Kim Jong-un's regime could lead to catastrophic consequences.
And we're calling globally for all countries to participate in exerting pressure on North Korea. This is the way you make your voice heard, is through action. Any failure to take action diminishes your vote for these resolutions of the past, it diminishes your vote for future resolutions, and it devalues your seat at this council. We must have full, complete compliance by all members of the council.
Chinese government officials also urged the UN to put pressure on North Korea, but the tension surrounding the region has shed light on international divisions between China and the U.S. While the Trump administration has called for an immediate halt of North Korea's nuclear program, China is pushing for talks and cautions against using military force. The U.S. economy saw a major dip in its January to March quarter. The GDP pointed to the weakest growth in 3 years. Analysts say slower consumer spending may be partly the result of a warmer winter. Higher temperatures mean less money spent on utilities. President Trump has claimed his program for major tax cuts for individuals and businesses would help boost the GDP. Congress passed a stopgap measure today to avoid the first government shutdown since 2013. It gives lawmakers until next Friday to finish the negotiations on the spending bill that will fund the government through September 30th. Major items on the negotiating table include defense spending and Puerto Rico's struggling Medicaid program. Tomorrow marks the first 100 days of the Trump administration. House and Senate Democratic representatives held a meeting today to discuss Trump's performance. Minority House Leader Nancy Pelosi said Trump had succeeded in one way, mobilizing the American people, especially the Democratic Party. President Trump has repeatedly discounted the 100-day mark as a ridiculous standard. Camila Kerwin, Columbia Radio News.
Football fans are in the middle of the second most important event of the year after the Super Bowl, the NFL Draft. For those looking to get a spot with the pros, it is the most important event. And for the 3 nights of must-watch TV on ESPN, they dress for their moment in the spotlight. Nick Arrington is a model, marketing consultant, and, for those keeping track, a Giants fan. I talked to him about the growing role of style and money in the NFL draft.
It's like an extravaganza almost at this point. There's a red carpet, there's cameras everywhere, there's interviews going on, GQ's on the red carpet, there's a lot going on.
And this has become about more than just sports. It's also become about fashion, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, these young guys put on their best. We like to call it our Sunday's best and step out to impress.
Like, how did this evolve from being a sports event to also being a fashion event and like an entertainment sort of event?
I think the media plays a big role on, what these guys are wearing. They're always on the red carpet, whether they're going to the Oscars or they're going to the ESPYs. And these guys are now donning the covers of GQ, Esquire. They're everywhere. They have stylists now. They have big paychecks. They can buy, whatever they want. So they want to look like, their old friends that were just side by side with them on the bench. And I think it's their time to say, look, I have swag before I signed this $1 million contract. I've been doing this for forever.
And corporate sponsorship plays a big role in the draft and in the outfits themselves.
Oh, definitely. In the NCAA, you can't accept anything while you're still playing. So now when you enter the draft and you're no longer in their purview, big companies are scouting the next top talent for the face of their brand, just like the Dallas Cowboys or the New York Giants are looking for their new strong safety, tight end, or running back. So if these companies can get these guys while they're young, before they blow up and they're the next rookie of the year or MVP or Super Bowl champion, it's time to get them now.
And the sponsors also get involved in the actual outfits, right? Like I heard there was a player who was sponsored by beef jerky.
Definitely. It was super cool. It was a bright blue jacket. And it was interesting. It's like, what are you going to do? Are you going to make it look like a NASCAR jacket, which would be incredibly tacky? They didn't do that. But the beef jerky sponsor, they did like an advertisement on the lining of the jacket, which I think was super cool. Subtle, out of the box. I've never seen anything quite like that before, and I think that was super cool. And I think they've definitely started a new trend for sure.
And do you think these young guys are really like kind of setting a tone? Like, do you think that young guys out there are looking to them for, and like be inspired by their fashion?
Oh, 100%. I'm pretty sure they're sitting on the sofa, definitely congratulating them to signing that contract. But they're also looking at what they're wearing, and they're like, well, I'm going to kill it next year because I'm going to the draft too. And they're already thinking about what they're going to wear 365 days in advance.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick. This was really great.
Cheers. Thank you.
Running a small business in New York City is hard, famously hard. A lot of them don't make it, yet some stick around for decades and become fixtures in their communities. But over the weekend, one Morningside Heights store was forced to close its doors after nearly 50 years. Melissa Casares reports on what Liberty House's closure means for the neighborhood.
At the corner of 112th Street and Broadway, there's a small store with big glass windows. Customers are streaming in. The shop sells one-of-a-kind imported items from around the world. Wooden masks from West Africa hang on the yellow walls. Red Pakistani spice boxes and blue porcelain tea sets from Japan sit on the counter. Everything is on sale. But these discounts at Liberty House aren't the kind employees ever wanted to offer. The store is closing, and it's time to clear the shelves.
To me, it's rather traumatic to have the store closed because I bought so many presents here over the years.
Like what?
Well, they were always rather unique. Lots of jewelry, earrings, bracelets, necklaces.
That's Lisa Red. She lives a few blocks away and shopped at Liberty House for years. She says she's seen a lot of locally owned stores like this one shut down on the Upper West Side.
And that's what's heartbreaking. There used to be a store for children called Karen Alexis that was on the Columbus in the 80s, and that closed.
And Liberty House used to have another location on 92nd Street and Broadway.
Liberty House closed in the 80s. That was upsetting, So now where do we go from here?
That's what Kathy Hawkins is trying to figure out. She's the store's owner. She says she tried her best to save the shop, but it didn't work out.
I don't know that I've really been able to process it yet, if that's the right way to put it.
Hawkins' store is the last of a chain established in the 60s. At the time, Liberty House sold handbags, dresses, and quilts made by a Southern co-op factory. It helped provide income to poor Black communities.
All the money went after the cost of rent and utilities would go to Mississippi.
Right back into the hands of factory workers. That's a fair trade business. And Liberty House prioritized that strategy for decades. Ted Petrikis is the president of the Retail Federation of New York. He says if you think fair trade is a big seller, it's not that simple.
What it comes down to is this. We're going to talk and talk and talk as consumers about how we support
things like fair trade.
But Petraica says fair trade items are more expensive to manufacture, and customers don't really want to pay higher prices. So
we go back online to try to find some place where we can get something that looks like that thing that we wanted for cheaper. Well, wait a minute. You can't have it both ways.
Today's consumer is looking for bargains.
And primarily, I think it's because of the internet.
Hawkins is right. If this sounds like the typical failing New York business story, that's because it is. The National Retail Federation says brick-and-mortar store sales are expected to grow at 2.8% in 2017. But online retail's growth, that's expected to be between 8 and 12%, up 3 times higher than the growth rate of the industry as a whole. Across the street from Liberty House, Carola Karstens is walking up the block. She's a 37-year-old artist. She says a big percentage of her purchases are online.
I don't know, maybe the 60%, maybe more, yeah.
Karsten says she's never been inside Liberty House. For brick-and-mortar stores, she's part of the problem. She says buying online is more convenient.
I mean, it's easy. If you don't like it, you can return it.
But back across the street inside Liberty House, Hawkins says she can't afford to take on giants like Amazon. So she decided not to invest more money in the store and pull the plug. And today is the last day. There's just an hour left before the doors close. Friends and longtime clients gathered to give the store a jazz funeral.
Down by the riverside, down by the riverside.
The singers form a semicircle in front of a wall of half-empty shelves. Gray-haired visitors crowd together, sitting on antique trunks. Workers dab tears from their eyes. One of them is owner Kathy Hawkins' daughter, Christy Croslin. She says she grew up in her mother's store.
I've never lived in a world without Liberty House, so it's something that's been on the Upper West Side for a very, very long time. So it's weird to think about little people growing up on the Upper West Side not getting the same experience.
The next generation of Upper West Siders will find a different business at the corner of 112th Street. Croslin says she doesn't know what the space will turn into, but she does hope one thing.
I just really hope it's not a bank or a coffee shop.
With over 1,700 coffee shops in the city, it might. But it'll take a while to empty out the last of Liberty House's merchandise. There are still teapots, jewelry, and wooden furniture left over from the final sale. Croslin says maybe, just maybe, they'll try selling some of them online. Melissa Cáceres, Columbia Radio News.
For a lot of neighborhoods, new development means new residents coming in. Often, it also means tension between expensive new buildings and longtime residents.
In Inwood in northern Manhattan, where many apartments are rent-stabilized and affordable, some are proposing an unusual solution. A community land trust would allow longtime residents who live on the land more say in how development would change their neighborhood. Devin Brisky has more.
Normally, the Inwood Public Library is filled with whispers and librarians reminding patrons to stay quiet. The loudest sound you'll hear is a magazine page turning. It's the last place you'd expect to hear yelling, but now the library is a hotbed of controversy and noise.
You never have an answer to this question. You always say the library is going to be owned publicly, but the rest of the land is going to be given away to the developer. That's unacceptable. Why can you not answer that question? What is the ownership structure of this plan?
The lady has the floor here. That's Inwood resident Karos Ismaili. A video clip captured a showdown between him and Inwood City Councilman Idanis Rodriguez over the future of the library. Now, the library is a boxy gray brick building with 3 stories. But if the de Blasio administration has its way, it will be rezoned, growing to accommodate anywhere from 10 to 17 stories. The city requested proposals from developers to build affordable housing on top of the existing building. This is the latest of several attempts to rezone and develop the neighborhood over the past 2 years. And residents like Cheryl Pam are angry.
When the mayor started talking about rezoning, I started posting on Facebook about it.
Frustrated posts. Pam has lived in Inwood for over a decade. She's active in local politics. Her Twitter profile describes her as an incorruptible public servant, one who's currently worried about displacement.
Because this area is really working class community, and it's a place where people can still afford to pay rent. We have almost 90% of our apartments that are rent stabilized, and that's a very big deal.
She's right. According to data from the Furman Center at NYU, 86% of apartments in Inwood are rent stabilized. So Pam helped start a group called Northern Manhattan is Not for Sale to fight new development. Last fall, it protested another proposed development project in Inwood, Sherman Plaza, a luxury high-rise. Councilman Adonis Rodriguez made a surprise appearance to announce that he'd vote against the rezoning.
Of this moment, I will not be supporting the rezoning of Sherman Road.
But rezoning is how de Blasio plans to encourage affordable housing development. And many residents agree that truly affordable housing is needed. They just don't trust private developers. They say what de Blasio has proposed isn't affordable to them. So some community members have an idea, a compromise. Give the land to us as a community land trust. Inwood resident Cheryl Pam again.
Community land trust, as soon as you say those words, it sounds enticing. It's like, especially in this context where the developers are taking over every inch of available space in New York City and people really feel threatened. So community land trust just sounds like the Sugar Plum Fairy's coming.
But what is a community land trust? It's a complicated ownership structure. Tenants, community leaders, and housing experts form a board of directors. They make decisions together about how to use the land. They're stewards of the land, making sure it's serving the interests of the community, not of private developers. Tom Angotti teaches urban policy and planning at CUNY. He says these trusts take the profit motive out of the land, which makes it cheaper for renters.
It's taking off the table the option of reselling land for a profit, which lowers its price, of course. If it can't be resold for a profit, then it really has no value on the market.
So housing costs are much lower because no one's trying to make a profit off the land. There's currently only one other community land trust that provides housing in New York City. But community land trusts are not new. There are over 200 of them in America. The first trust has roots in civil rights era Georgia. Its goal was to give former sharecroppers land security. There's even a documentary about it, Arc of Justice. Here's Congressman John Lewis in the documentary's trailer.
There was this growing feeling on the part of so many individuals and leaders within the movement that if you had your own piece of land, you could do things. You wouldn't be dependent on others.
The Georgia Trust survived for 15 years but eventually went bankrupt. The trust's farmers needed a new irrigation system and couldn't get access to credit. Still, the idea lived on. One city in America has relied on trusts for over 30 years, Burlington, Vermont, ever since Mayor Bernie Sanders allocated funds to establish a community land trust in the 80s. Today, nearly 1 in 10 housing units in Burlington is located on a land trust. Tom Angotti says the idea took hold in New York City during the 1970s.
When there was a lot of abandoned land and a lot of abandoned buildings, there was a major disinvestment in New York City by property owners, and that led people to spontaneously think about alternatives of managing their own housing.
Alternatives like community land trusts. That's when residents of Cooper Square on the Lower East Side began fighting the city for control over the public land they lived on. It's easy to form a trust, but it's hard to get the land. After decades of struggle, they succeeded in 1991 with a friendly policy from Mayor Dinkins. Pam says for land trusts to work, they need government buy-in. In New York, that means from the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, HPD.
A lot of people are like, well, we could form a trust without. We don't need HPD. And yes, we do. We need HPD. They can make our lives miserable. They can complicate things, or they can assist us and aid us and facilitate.
And some in city government are facilitating. Recently, HPD says it will consider proposals from community land trusts for the library alongside private developers. Alan Leung has worked on both sides of the equation. In graduate school, he studied land trusts. Now, he's the project manager at a for-profit housing developer that focuses on affordable housing. He says there can be advantages to working with a for-profit developer.
A lot of times without an ownership stake or without the benefits accruing to a private owner, it can be difficult to incentivize maybe the quality or the level of development that one would hope for.
Leung says private developers have access to more money, so they can design higher quality buildings. But back in Inwood, residents are focused on affordable rent. Most of them, that is. At a meeting last week at a local church, they argued about the community land trust proposal. Activist Marshall Douglas said most of the community hadn't been consulted about the plan.
What's clear here is this whole ambitious outline is not endorsed by the majority.
Some at the meeting said long-term affordability should be the priority, while many wanted no changes to the library at all. HPD has yet to announce when it will be responding to the proposals, and the mayor's office didn't reply to a request for comment. For now, all Inwood residents can do is wait and make some more noise. Devin Brisky, Columbia Radio News.
Skipping south a few blocks now, we bring you another chapter in New York history. National monuments punctuate the city but are often overlooked by New Yorkers. This week, parks are back in the conversation, with President Trump's executive order requesting a review of national monuments. Acacia O'Connor visits an Uptown memorial and learns about its underappreciated history.
Across from Riverside Church in Manhattan, a gaggle of teenagers and their chaperones are eating pizza in the sunshine. One is Kyle Zaricki. Do you guys know anything about this monument?
No.
Anything at all? Do you know what it's called?
No, I know that has American flags on it.
Zaricki is part of a middle school band group from Las Vegas. They just played a concert inside the church. But the marble monument adorned with American flag bunting across the street was a surprise, says his mom, Lisa.
No, we've been to New York, but we've never been to this end of it. So when we pulled up and saw the beautiful church and we saw this monument, we're like, oh, this is a great place to have lunch and learn a little bit of history.
This is one of a dozen national monuments in New York City. It's modeled on the tomb of Napoleon and on the ancient mausoleum of Halicarnassus. More importantly, it's the final resting place of Civil War general and 18th President Ulysses S. Grant.
People would say his name in the same breath as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. That's obviously not the case today.
Don Stanko is lead park ranger at the General Grant National Memorial. It's a big week for the memorial. Yesterday marked Grant's 195th birthday.
When this is built in the 1890s, they really liked him. They really liked him. He is the most famous man in America. He's probably the most famous American internationally at the time. He is the hero of America. There's no one else even close.
Stanko says when Grant died in 1885, well over 1 million people attended his funeral procession. Even his enemies came to pay their respects, including Simon Buckner, a Confederate soldier.
Fort Donelson, Buckner's the commander, and he will be forced to surrender to Grant, and he will be a pallbearer at his funeral. That's awesome. That's amazing. Did Wellington serve as pallbearer at Napoleon's funeral? I don't think so.
Grant still has some fans today. Frank Scaturo is one. He's founder of the Grant Monument Association. He says maintaining a 200-year-old building in Manhattan is challenging given the pressures to tear down the old in favor of the new.
The values that are connected to this man's public career and the great sacrifice that occurred under his leadership, that is a much more lasting and profound legacy than just about any other architectural or other sort of cultural trend that you'll see in New York.
Local historian Eric Washington says it's about more than just Grant's tomb. Like Central Park, New York needs its undeveloped spaces.
And we tend to have this odd concept that because the space is natural or not developed, that it's not being used. And you can't interview the trees or the birds who, if they could speak, I'll speak for them, would say, we're using it, we're here, we're growing, we're thriving, this is not empty space.
Washington says national monuments like this one aren't idle places. They do something to us. They make us better citizens. Acacia O'Connor, Columbia Radio News.
For returning veterans, there are plenty of challenges. Anxiety and depression are common, and it can be difficult to adapt to new environments.
Now, one organization called Team RWB is using physical challenges to help veterans and civilians alike cope with stress and find community. Max Hauptmann has more.
It's a gray, rainy day in Jersey City, but hundreds of people are gathered here with the skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan in the distance, preparing to run an urban obstacle course. Ray Garcia has a shaved head. Jimmy Spiegel is powerfully built, and he has one prosthetic leg. Both men are at the starting line, getting ready to run.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
They're off and running. Garcia and Spiegel climb over rope ladders and carry heavy sandbags. They swing across a series of metal steel rings. For Garcia and Spiegel, this race is about more than just climbing rope ladders or running over balance beams. They're here to support New York area veterans. They're part of a group called Team RWB. It's designed to enrich the lives of veterans through physical challenges. Hershey Freitas is another member of the group. She's handing out water, energy bars, and bananas on the sidelines.
We try to get the veterans off the couch and integrate them back to the community. We do everything from running to cycling to triathlons, social events, bowling, rock climbing, just hiking, anything that you can think of.
Freitas was in the Air Force, and today she's one of about 20 Team RWB members competing and helping out. And events like the one today are a big part of the reason why she got involved in the group 3 years ago. Freitas says that for veterans and other Team RWB members, an important part of reintegrating into the civilian world is overcoming tough challenges.
Emotionally and physically challenging, yeah, it's amazing. I cannot stress it enough. The glory that you get from seeing your friends achieve something that they thought they're never going to be able to do.
As Freitas says, trying to challenge yourself can be critical in reestablishing routines for returning veterans, even years after they transition to civilian life.
You know, it's so hard to come from being deployed into the regular life, and people don't understand you. Well, this is the way. So, yeah, it helps a lot.
Team RWB was founded in 2010 by Mike Irwin, an Army captain. Today, there are chapters all across the country, including 6 in the New York area. Each chapter is different, but there's one thing they all emphasize: group physical activities and the social bonding that comes with them. Exercise isn't a cure, but for people with a stress disorder, anxiety, or depression, it can help. That's especially true for veterans coming from a culture that placed a strong emphasis on fitness. An obstacle course like the one in Jersey City is a perfect chance to bond with each other. Sandy Cherboga is a Team RWB chapter president in northern New Jersey.
You have a group that it's running, and maybe you want to start running, but you don't know where to start, or you don't have any friends that want to run or do anything active, but you know that there's a group of people that, let's say on Wednesdays, they go and kickbox, and you wanted to try to kickbox.
Along with exercise, there's a social aspect that Cherboga says is also important. It's not just working out, it's doing it with a group of people and establishing a support system.
You're making connections. So now you're coming out, you're going to be active, you're going to move. Now you're also going to meet a few people that you didn't know before. You might make some friends.
I think that's a perfect example of the men and women coming back, and you want to give back, and what are you going to do?
Leslie Lightfoot is a clinical psychologist who works with returning veterans. She agrees that tough physical challenges can have a positive psychological impact on people who are used to pushing themselves. It's a way to keep contributing.
That's one thing about the military, and I can only speak from the medical piece of it because that's what I know. But you never feel like you've done enough.
Back at the obstacle course, Ray Garcia and Jimmy Spiegel are nearing the finish line. The rain has started to pick up, and their faces are red with exhaustion. But there's one last event. A rope climb. First up is Garcia, his wet sneakers squeaking on the rope. And then Spiegel. They crossed the finish line with a crowd cheering them on.
How does it feel finishing?
Awesome. It was great. We hit every obstacle. We finished under an hour. That's about all you could ask for.
With his prosthetic leg, Spiegel is considered an adaptive athlete, an athlete who's overcome a permanent physical or mental injury. He's been training for 3 years, and he uses these events to show veterans and other Team RWB members that the loss of a limb doesn't have to be a setback.
For me, RWB got me back into fitness. I was 70 pounds heavier before they took me in and started getting me training again and whatnot. You know, I'm trying to get more adaptive people out there to go in these events to show them that they can do it.
There's no single cure for PTSD, anxiety, or depression, and there's no single way to help veterans reintegrate into the civilian world. But for the members of Team RWB, getting off the couch is a helpful first step. Max Hauptman, Columbia Radio News.
Today, most subway lines in Manhattan are hidden underground, but until the mid-20th century, an entire network of elevated train lines ran up and down the city.
Next month will mark the anniversary of the dismantling of the very last of these lines, the 3rd Avenue L. For 77 years, the L rattled the windows of tenement buildings and shadowed the storefronts of shop owners. But almost nothing remains of it today, except for the memories of the New Yorkers who were there to see it come down. Camila Kerwin reports.
Walter Zulig is a train guy. As a kid, he used to ride the elevated lines around New York City for fun. He worked as a legal counsel for the MTA and Metro North for about 30 years. In other words, he defended trains for a living. Once upon a time, he even asked his new fiancée to ride one of the elevated lines with him in Brooklyn, like as a date.
We were just engaged and he said, "Come, let's ride the L."
Oh, that was barrels of fun.
So, Walter Zulig loves trains. But there's one in particular he has a soft spot for. The 3rd Avenue L, a steel spine that ran up and down Manhattan until 1955.
Well, inside the station, when you walk in, of course, it was very old, and there was a change booth there and a row of old-fashioned turnstiles, these big, wide, like wooden paddle-type turnstiles. So you'd put a token in the turnstile, and it would go to-jum, to-jum.
And passengers paid a station agent who pushed a plunger to unlock a gate to let them in.
Old footage of the train shows exactly what he's talking about.
The route was past miles of tenements, giving the passengers a glimpse into every window.
Now, if it was a cold day, there was a potbelly stove inside the station, and that would be stoken away, and the train would come rumbling in, and basically they looked like wooden cars, but they did have some steel in them.
Lots of noise.
The 3rd Avenue L ran for 77 years. Imagine reaching your arm out the window of your tiny New York City apartment and being able to touch a passing train. That was what the presence of the L was like. But by the mid-20th century, the structure was falling apart, and it would have been extremely expensive to fix. Ridership was down, people complained that the train was loud and dirty and dark. So New York City decided to do to the 3rd Avenue L what it had already done to every other L. Tear it down.
6th Avenue and 9th Avenue, they had subways to replace those L's. And 3rd Avenue, they just tore it down, and there really was no replacement.
No replacement, even though the city had promised a replacement for years. A 2nd Avenue subway. The same 2nd Avenue subway that just opened this past January, 7 decades after it was first promised.
It takes 70 years to get anything done in cities and transportation. That's why I got into computers.
That's Richard J. Solomon. In the 60s, before he got into computers, he was an urban planner in New York. He's written a lot about city transit. And he says the reason the city went ahead and demolished the train without a replacement, it boiled down to the same reason anything big ever happens in New York. Real estate and money.
The city was bankrupt by the 50s, and there was tremendous pressure from the real estate interests to tear down the L. And the 2nd Avenue subway never got started. There was a mistake to tear down the 3rd Avenue L when they did.
No 2nd Avenue subway would mean an even more crowded Lexington Avenue subway and very cramped city buses. Thousands of commuters would face a major disruption in their daily lives. But on May 12, 1955, a radio reporter stood on 7th Street and 3rd Avenue right outside Cooper Union to make this announcement.
And we're looking out on the scene of the last run today of the 3rd Avenue L. Oh, considering the noise it makes and the dust it stirs up and the way it darkens our street, the Cooper Union family will join other 3rd Avenue folks in praising the passing of the L.
When Walter Zulig heard the news, he made his way down to Chatham Square and got into the very end of the last car with his 8mm film camera. And for all the vitriol against the old rickety L, the scene he captured that day tells a different story. The train was packed. People were honking horns, hanging out their apartment windows, yelling goodbye. The passengers, they didn't seem to want the ride to end.
People started pulling the emergency cord, and we went psh, and of course the train came to a screeching halt. And so we would sit there a bit, and then we would move again.
Well, things change, and the L is at the end of the line. This is the last of the 3rd Avenue L, filmed just before its trains rumbled into history.
And a little while later, somebody else pulled the cord. And this went on for quite a while. I mean, I don't know how many times the cord was pulled, but I would venture to say it was 15 times anyway.
In the mountains of brick and steel, it soon will be forgotten amid America's changing scene.
Zulig did not forget. He shows me a picture he took in 1956 of the very last pillars left standing from the L. It looks sort of like a shrunken steel Arch de Triomphe in the middle of 42nd Street and 3rd. That's the only photo he took of the demolition. But today, New Yorkers can see a lot more. There's an exhibit of them up right now at the Transit Museum, all taken by a 17-year-old photographer.
A young fellow who was about my age at the time started taking all these pictures.
That young fellow? That's this guy.
My school was right on the corner of 79th and 3rd.
Sid Kaplan's a native New Yorker. He's 79 now, like Solomon. But when he was 17, he became sort of obsessed with taking pictures of the L's dismantling.
And just being right in front of the school when it was being dismantled, of course I was going to take pictures of it. After a while, it becomes a disease.
Kaplan's photos show workers standing on steel beams, the stained glass ornamentation. In one shot, taken from high up, you can see the train as far as it goes, until the lines converge on each other. Kaplan says, sure, it was sad to see the L go. But in a city that always seems to be eating itself alive, it didn't catch anybody by surprise.
All your life you were walking down a street and the building you saw last week has just been demolished. So I was always aware that there are things in New York that here today, gone tomorrow.
The L is gone now. This is what it sounds like today on 7th Street and 3rd Avenue. Kaplan is pointing to the edges of the street where the L used to stand, remembering what exactly is gone.
You would be under a canopy of train tracks. And the train, there was a certain kind of music. It was a certain kind of music.
This reunion was already 19 years old. From these windows, people have seen L trains lighted, at first by candles. Maybe you didn't hear me while that L was going on. You know, that's a historic sound.
Hardly a trace remains of the old 3rd Avenue L. But if you go to the Gun Hill Road station in the Bronx, you can see the last bit of it. At the corner of Gun Hill and White Plains Road, a long steel ramp leads up to the existing 1 and 2 lines. There's no plaque, no information. That stretch of green steel is all that's left of the L. Camila Kerwin, Columbia Radio News.
Coming up, there are 2 commentaries, both about things that changed from childhood. My co-host and commentator, Catherine Sullivan, reflects on the meaning of trust, forgiveness, and religion, and how her views changed over time. She talks about how beliefs that came so easily during childhood have become more complicated with age.
At my Catholic high school, we had to go to confession 4 times a year. We lined up outside the gymnasium. Pairs of metal chairs dotted the basketball court, spaced just far enough apart so that if you spoke in a low, almost whisper, the classmate next to you wouldn't hear you as you divulged your most shameful moments to an old man in a long white robe. Half a dozen priests came from nearby parishes to handle the sheer quantity of sin at Seton Catholic Central High School. Everybody went to confession. I guess the chance to have your earthly transgressions unconditionally absolved through Holy Sacrament was just too good for any 16-year-old to pass up. Standing in line outside the gym, jittery with nerves, we examined our moral conscience and tallied up our sins in our heads. Much of our fate depended on the priest we were randomly assigned. Everyone hoped to get someone they liked. There was Father Kane, a kind but stern old man who had known me since I was born. Going to him was like being disciplined by your grandfather. There was Father O'Connor, the young, attractive priest who looked like he still belonged in high school. The thought of sitting so close to him that your knees nearly touched his, looking directly into his eyes and confessing your deepest secrets, was too much to handle. Then there was Father Hours, our theology teacher. He was a round, jovial man who joked around with the boys in the class, playfully punching them in the hallway and giving them nicknames. He wasn't intimidating or strict. Everyone preferred to confess to him. I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone besides a priest. I'm going to tell you my sins. I always listed the same 3 things throughout middle and high school. Number 1, I fought with my sister. Number 2, I was rude to my parents. And number 3, I gossiped about friends. I would sit there and wonder if I had scandalized the priest with my depravity, but instead he would nod and calmly assign a penance, usually some number of prayers to recite. Father Hours, the theology teacher, always gave an easy penance, 2 Hail Marys and keep up the good work. Then he'd lift his hand over my head and absolve me of all of my sin. That was it. Clean slate. I'd leave the gym feeling overwhelmingly relieved, walking on clouds. I stopped going to confession when I left for college, around the same time I stopped going to church. There were a lot of reasons to fall out of faith. Mostly, I grew out of it. But also, my high school years coincided with the exposure of rampant sex abuse in the church. The scandals expedited my growing unease with organized religion. There's not much I miss about Catholicism. The strict and antiquated views on modern life I gladly leave behind me. But confession, the idea of being forgiven for all the wrong you've done, simply because you chose to admit it out loud, there's nothing else that comes close to that. My therapist tries to make me examine wrongdoing. She picks it apart. She doesn't dissolve it all with a lift of her hand and some divine intervention. Likewise, friends can only commiserate and relate with my feelings of moral failure, not release me from them. Secular society is in a constant search for ways to cultivate self-forgiveness. We practice mindfulness. We meditate with the assistance of iPhone apps. We go to brunch and down bottomless mimosas. We spend a lot of money trying to achieve the feelings I once got from the 4-minute sacrament of reconciliation. On a visit home several years ago, I was catching up with a high school friend. "Have you heard about Father Hours?" she asked. Our theology teacher and confessor of choice, Father Hours, had been arrested for possession of child pornography. Every time this comes up with people from home, we acknowledge it, and then we get quiet. No one knows what to say. No one is ready to examine it. Instead, I think about all those sins I confessed to him as a teenager, and I wonder how many Hail Marys he's saying now.
On Sunday mornings, you'll find Catherine seeking eternal forgiveness at her local yoga studio.
Spring has arrived, and from Sarah Gibson, we have a commentary about a seasonal food that brings a taste from home.
In Vermont, where I'm from, the joke is there are 5 seasons: summer, fall, winter, spring, and mud. For some of us right about now, there's a 6th, ramp season. Ramps are wild onions that look like scallions, with purple stems and neon green leaves you can spot 50 feet away. They're tender and sweet, perfect sautéed in butter. When I was a kid, we would pull on our mud boots and head out with a paring knife to my dad's secret ramp spot. I'm pretty sure it was on the property of some weekender snob from New York City. In other words, it was open for trespass. We'd park at the bottom of the road so neighbors wouldn't recognize our car. The fear, of course, was that they would return the next day, follow our muddy tracks, and harvest the remaining ramps for themselves. Ramps take about 6 years to mature. They're easily over-harvested. You have to restrain yourself. You have to guard your secret so it won't get spoiled. This attitude is quintessentially Vermont. It's part Puritan, part redneck, part back to the lander. It's who I am. My parents aren't from Vermont, but they come from rural stock. They liked the frugal self-reliance of Vermonters and the idea of raising a family in a town of 1,000 people and 0 stoplights. The closest city has 16,000 people. The whole state has 600,000, plus 4 million acres of forest and a chain of mountains that runs up to Canada. When you're raised in a town like mine, in a privileged family like mine, the sacrifices are obvious. Hours to get to a good doctor and to orchestra rehearsal, battles with struggling schools, and a lurking narrow-mindedness that veers into bigotry. But here's the payoff. We know how to grow food. We can read the sky for incoming storms. We drive stick shift. We swim in spring-fed lakes. When we point to a mountain, we know its name and what the vista looks like from its summit. And then there's the people. We know each other's business for better and for worse. The families that have been there for centuries fight with newcomers like my parents over taxes and land use, but we depend on each other if there's a fire or a blizzard or a death. When a neighbor dies, hundreds gather at the town hall, setting aside our grudges and telling stories about the person we've lost. Then we feast on home-cooked dishes. I moved to New York City last summer, and last fall's election illuminated our country's rural-urban divide. Even when I don't agree with them, I have some empathy towards rural Americans who get righteous about tradition and belonging. But the longer I stay in New York, the more I like it. And the less I understand what it means to be rural. I'm scared I'm becoming more like those city snobs whose land we trespassed than like my parents, who love my provincial home and call that a good life. I called my mom a few days ago. They're selling ramps at the farmers markets here. Her response, ew. She's worried that the ramps grew in suburban, polluted soil. She promised once my dad goes out for a harvest, she'll clean the ramps and send them to me. I'm waiting for that smelly, strangely shaped package to arrive at my apartment. I'll hold it to my nose. I'll breathe it in, and I'll be home.
When she's not reporting a story, Sarah is demanding samples of Vermont cheese in the dairy section of Zabar's. Well, that does it for today's broadcast of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Our executive producer today was Sarah Gibson. Our senior producer, Hannah Long-Higgins, worked with Camilla Kudelska and Max Hauptmann.
Senior editor Lindsay Cortica and assistant editor Melissa Caceres led our copy team.
Director Shushmita Patek coordinated our studio production with Devin Brisky and Kristen Schwab.
Our web team, Taylor Wisner and Pia Peterson, got this stream live to the web.
Radio professors Carrie Donahue, Joe Richmond, Sally Herships, and Osa Secker advised our staff. I'm Meg Dalton.
And I'm Katherine Sullivan. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. Until next week, you can always find something on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.